The night of October 12, 1307, hung over Paris like a shroud. In the massive fortress known as the Temple, where the Knights Templar had maintained their French headquarters for generations, Grand Master Jacques de Molay had just returned from attending a royal funeral. He had walked alongside King Philip IV himself, unaware that sealed orders bearing the royal seal had already been distributed to every bailiff and seneschal across France. The instructions were explicit. At dawn on Friday, October 13, arrest every Templar in the kingdom. But in the hours before sunrise, something else was happening. According to testimony later extracted under torture, certain brothers had received warning. In the treasury vaults beneath the temple compound, men moved in darkness. Iron-bound chests were loaded onto wagons. Documents accumulated over 2 centuries were sealed into leather cases. The sound of horses echoed through cobbled streets as columns of riders departed the city, heading west toward the Atlantic coast. Gérard de Villiers, preceptor of the Paris Temple, led 50 mounted men carrying cargo, whose contents would never be recorded in any surviving ledger. At the port of La Rochelle on the Bay of Biscay, the Templar fleet rode at anchor. These were not warships but merchant vessels, galleys and cogs that had transported wine, pilgrims, and supplies between France and the Holy Land for generations. How many ships departed in those final hours remains disputed. A Templar sergeant named Jean de Chalon would later testify that 18 galleys put to sea under Templar command, carrying what he described as the treasury of the order. Whether he witnessed this personally or merely heard rumors, his testimony would echo through centuries of speculation. When dawn broke on October 13th, royal soldiers found the treasury empty. The legendary wealth of the Templars, gold accumulated through banking operations that spanned Christendom, relics brought from Jerusalem, documents that chronicled the order's deepest secrets, had vanished. Over the following weeks, torture chambers across France extracted confessions from captured Templars, forced admissions of heresy and blasphemy designed to justify their destruction. But certain questions remained unanswered. Where had the ships gone? What cargo did they carry? And most troubling for King Philip's agents, where were the Templars who had escaped? The Atlantic coast of medieval Europe offered few safe harbors for fugitives condemned by both king and pope. Portugal might provide temporary refuge, but the Portuguese crown walked a careful line between protecting the order and maintaining relations with Rome. The Germanic territories were fragmented and uncertain. England, deeply in debt to French political pressure, could not be trusted. But there was one kingdom beyond the immediate reach of papal authority, one ruler who had nothing to lose by defying Rome. Scotland, where Robert the Bruce had seized the throne through murder committed in a church, stood excommunicated and isolated. The Pope had declared Bruce's kingship invalid. English armies sought to crush Scottish independence. In this desperate situation, what did the arrival of several hundred trained knights matter? Men who brought not merely swords but knowledge of fortification, logistics, financial organization, and the hardened discipline of warriors who had fought in the Holy Land. The ships that departed La Rochelle in October 1307 sailed into history and legend simultaneously. No harbor records document their arrival in Scottish waters. No royal chronicles acknowledge accepting condemned heretics. But within 7 years, an outnumbered Scottish army would defeat the English at Bannockburn, in a battle whose outcome contemporary observers found difficult to explain. And in the decades that followed, grave markers would appear across western Scotland. Simple stones carved with nothing but the outline of a straight sword. Anonymous memorials to warriors who died without names, their identities erased from history as thoroughly as the order they had served. To understand what drove the Templars to seek refuge in Scotland, one must first comprehend what they had become. By 1307, founded in 1119 in Jerusalem as a small brotherhood sworn to protect pilgrims, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon had evolved into something unprecedented in medieval Europe. By the early 14th century, the Templars answered only to the Pope, maintained over 800 properties across Christendom, and operated the medieval world's first international banking system. Kings borrowed from them. Nobles entrusted their estates to Templar management. Their white mantles emblazoned with red crosses symbolized both military might and financial power. This very success created fatal vulnerabilities. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, had exhausted his treasury through expensive wars against England and Flanders. He had already expelled the Jews from France and seized their property in 1306. He had debased the currency so aggressively that riots erupted in Paris, forcing the king to take refuge in the Temple fortress itself. Now Philip owed the Templars enormous sums, loans that had financed his military campaigns. The order's destruction would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, eliminating the debt, seizing liquid assets, and confiscating the vast properties the Templars held throughout France. But financial motivation alone cannot explain the intensity of the charges brought against them. The accusations went beyond ordinary heresy, into territories suggesting forbidden knowledge. Templars stood accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, and engaging in obscene rituals. These were not mere accusations of financial impropriety, but suggestions that the order harbored secrets threatening to the very foundations of Christian authority. Under torture, many Templars confessed to these crimes. Modern historians recognize these confessions as fabrications extracted through agony. Men will admit to anything when their bones are being broken. Yet the pattern of accusations hints at deeper fears. The Templars had spent 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during their early history. Archaeological surveys conducted in 1867 confirmed the existence of tunnels beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tunnels that contained Templar artifacts. What the Knights discovered in those underground chambers remains unknown, but their sudden rise to power and wealth following their return to Europe raised questions their contemporaries never stopped asking. Some whispered they had found the Ark of the Covenant. Others spoke of ancient manuscripts that told different stories about Christian origins. The most dangerous rumors suggested documents proving alternative genealogies, bloodlines that could challenge the authority of both church and crown. This context explains why Pope Clement V, despite initially protesting the arrests as violations of papal authority, eventually capitulated to French pressure. The bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, issued on November 22, 1307, ordered all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their assets. But enforcement varied dramatically across Europe. In Aragon, King James II refused to use torture and found no evidence of heresy. In Portugal, King Denis conducted his own investigation and declared the Templars innocent. In England, arrests proceeded slowly and half-heartedly. And in Scotland, the papal bull arrived at a kingdom that had effectively severed ties with Rome. Robert Bruce's situation in 1307 could hardly have been more precarious. He had murdered his rival John Comyn before the altar of a Franciscan church in Dumfries on February 10, 1306. The papacy responded with immediate excommunication. 6 weeks later, Bruce was crowned King of Scots, but without papal recognition or sanction. He faced English armies determined to crush Scottish independence, internal rivals who questioned his claim to the throne, and the condemnation of the church itself. His wife and daughter were imprisoned. 3 of his brothers were captured and executed by the English. He spent the winter of 1306 to 1307 hiding in the Western Highlands, or possibly the Hebrides, a fugitive king with a crown recognized by almost no one. Yet by 1314, Bruce would stand triumphant at Bannockburn, his position secured and Scottish independence effectively won. The transformation from hunted outlaw to victorious monarch occurred precisely during the years when Templar refugees would have been arriving in Scotland. Specialists in medieval warfare note that the Scottish victory at Bannockburn involved tactical sophistication unusual for the period, disciplined infantry formations, effective use of terrain, and a decisive cavalry charge at the crucial moment. Where Bruce acquired this military expertise remains debated, but the presence of Templars, men trained in the warfare of the Crusader states, experienced in cavalry tactics and desperate for any protection they could find, would have provided exactly the skills Bruce needed. The question is not whether Templars could have reached Scotland, but whether any evidence of their arrival survived the systematic erasure that followed. In 1956, workers at Kilmartin Parish Church in the Western Highlands of Scotland moved a collection of medieval grave slabs into a former burial aisle to protect them from weather damage. The stones had lain in the churchyard for centuries, some still marking graves, others long since separated from whatever remains they once covered. There were nearly 80 slabs in total, ranging from elaborately carved memorials depicting warriors in full battle dress to stark, simple stones bearing no decoration except the carved outline of a single straight sword. A plaque installed with the collection noted that the earliest stones dated to approximately 1300, the precise period when Templars fleeing France would have been arriving in Scotland. The village of Kilmartin sits in Argyll, the heart of medieval Scottish Gaelic culture, and a region where over 800 historic monuments cluster within just 6 miles. This was territory controlled in the early 14th century by Sir Neil Campbell, an ally and brother-in-law of Robert the Bruce. The area's strategic importance was undeniable. Situated near sea routes connecting Ireland, the Hebrides, and the Scottish mainland, it offered access and concealment in roughly equal measure. The grave slabs sheltered in the burial aisle represent only a fraction of the medieval stones scattered across the Kilmartin region, but they preserve patterns that specialists recognize from Templar burial sites across Europe. Researchers examining the collection identified specific characteristics linking these stones to known Templar graves. The slabs marked only with sword outlines, without names, without heraldic devices, without any indication of family or lineage, match burial practices documented at Templar sites in England, France, Spain, and the Holy Land. At those authenticated locations, Templar graves displayed consistent features: simplicity, austerity, frequent use of sword imagery, and deliberate anonymity. The warriors buried beneath these stones chose to die without acknowledgement of their identities, or had that choice made for them. Carbon dating and stylistic analysis of the Kilmartin stones confirm origins in the early 1300s and 1400s. The carving techniques suggest skilled masons familiar with military iconography. Some stones display swords depicted with specific details, crossguard shapes, pommel styles, blade proportions, that correspond to weapons used by military orders in the 14th century. One slab shows a sword, with what specialists identify as a scallop shell-shaped pommel, a symbol associated with pilgrimage and the crusading orders. These are not generic representations, but careful renderings of actual weapon types. The mystery deepens when examining the complete absence of these warriors from documentary records. Medieval Scotland kept extensive registers of land transactions, church benefices, and noble lineages. Yet the men buried at Kilmartin appear in none of these records. No wills mention them. No charters record their land transfers. No burgh records acknowledge their presence. They existed in stone but vanished from parchment, as if someone systematically removed every written trace of their existence, while allowing physical memorials to remain. Modern archaeological techniques have added new dimensions to the investigation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Kilmartin revealed additional unmarked graves beyond those with visible stones. Excavations conducted under license from Historic Environment Scotland uncovered burial orientations and grave goods suggesting military individuals of significant status. The positioning of bodies, the presence of weapons fragments, and the absence of typical civilian grave markers all point toward a population of warriors who lived and died in Kilmartin during the early 14th century, but left no names, no genealogies, no connections to documented Scottish families. Comparative analysis has identified similar patterns at other Scottish sites with suspected Templar connections. At Ballintrodoch in Midlothian, renamed Temple after serving as the principal Scottish Templar preceptory, carved stone fragments show architectural details matching Templar commanderies in France. At Marycoulter in Aberdeenshire, another documented Templar property, building foundations date to periods when the order was officially extinct. Radiocarbon analysis of timbers and organic materials from these structures consistently return dates between 1310 and 1350, precisely when Templars should not have existed anywhere in Christendom. The discovery pattern suggests not isolated incidents but coordinated concealment. Physical evidence confirms continued military and religious activity at former Templar sites well after 1312, when Pope Clement V formally dissolved the order. Yet documentary sources covering these same locations and periods contain suspicious gaps. Monastic cartularies that should record property transactions have missing pages. Royal registers show unexplained omissions. Church records display signs of alteration. Passages scraped away, dates modified, references to Brothers of the Temple overwritten or obliterated. The documentary silence is not passive absence but active erasure. suggesting powerful interests worked to ensure that whatever happened in Scotland after 1307 left as few traces as possible in the historical record. The stones at Kilmartin speak to what documents were made to forget. Reconstructing what happened between October 1307 and June 1314 requires assembling fragments from sources that were never meant to connect. The process begins with what can be established beyond dispute. King Philip IV of France issued secret arrest warrants for all Templars in his realm on September 14, 1307. The orders were sealed with instructions not to open them until October 12th. This gave the order approximately 4 weeks between the sealing of the warrants and their execution, enough time for information to leak through the networks of merchants, sympathetic clergy, and royal servants whose loyalties were divided. Contemporary accounts confirm that warnings circulated. Jean de Chalon's testimony, extracted in 1308, stated explicitly that Gerard de Villiers and other Templar officers had been informed of the impending catastrophe. Whether this intelligence came from sympathetic officials, from spies within the French court, or from the simple observation that Philip's agents were preparing something unprecedented remains unclear. What matters is that certain Templars knew what was coming and took action. Wagons departed Paris in the nights before October 13th. Ships left French ports with cargoes that went unrecorded. By the time royal soldiers stormed the temple compound, the treasury had been evacuated. The testimony about 18 galleys remains the only contemporary reference to the escape fleet. But specialists note significant problems with this evidence. First, Jean de Chalon never specified a departure port. The association with La Rochelle appears in later sources but not in the original interrogation records. Second, Chalon admitted he had not witnessed the departure personally, but had heard people talking about it. Hearsay testimony of dubious reliability. Third, maritime historians question whether the Templars actually possessed 18 galleys. Records suggest the order owned perhaps 4 warships and rented additional vessels as needed for transporting wine and supplies. Assembling 18 galleys would have required commandeering or hiring ships on short notice, a logistical challenge that seems unlikely given the need for secrecy. Yet the treasury indisputably vanished. When Philip's agents entered the Paris temple expecting to find vaults filled with 2 centuries of accumulated wealth, they discovered careful records of everything the order had possessed, but almost none of the actual valuables. Gold, silver, jewels, relics, and most critically, the complete archives of Templar business transactions, all gone. The scale of the disappearance suggests organized evacuation rather than panicked flight. Someone had time to select what to take and what to leave. Someone had access to transportation sufficient to move material wealth and documentary records simultaneously. Someone knew where to go. Scotland emerges as a probable destination through process of elimination. The Iberian kingdoms offered possibilities. Portugal in particular would prove remarkably protective of Templars within its borders. But reaching Iberia required sailing past the coast of hostile territory, or traveling overland through regions where French influence extended. The Germanic territories were fragmented and uncertain. England was too closely tied to French politics and too dependent on French goodwill to risk harboring condemned heretics. But Scotland in 1307 was effectively outside the international system. Robert Bruce had been excommunicated. His kingdom faced English invasion. The Pope's authority meant nothing in a realm that already defied Rome, and Scotland had an existing infrastructure of Templar properties that could facilitate arrival and integration of refugees. The documentary silence that follows is profound and deliberate. Scottish royal records from this period show gaps that specialists identify as systematic rather than accidental. Sequences of years are missing from exchequer rolls that should document crown revenues. Monastic cartularies that recorded property transactions have pages cut from their bindings with deliberate precision. Church registers covering 1307 to 1320 are incomplete across multiple dioceses. At Melrose Abbey, Holyrood, and other establishments with documented Templar connections, folios covering the crucial years are absent. The pattern is too consistent across too many archives to be coincidental loss. Someone moved through Scottish records systematically removing evidence. Cross-referencing the few surviving documents reveals additional anomalies. Properties officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller after the Templar dissolution continued to be called by their old names, the Temple, rather than new designations. Building accounts from the 1310s show construction at former Templar sites using techniques and designs consistent with Templar architectural tradition. Personnel records occasionally mention individuals whose descriptions suggest military backgrounds, but whose origins are never specified. These are shadows in the records, acknowledgments of presence without identification. The timeline reconstruction suggests a window of arrival between late 1307 and mid-1308. Ships departing French ports in October or November would have reached Scottish waters by winter. The western approaches, Argyll, the Inner Hebrides, offered natural landing points with established Gaelic communities less integrated into royal administration and more capable of providing initial shelter. From these coastal refugees, surviving Templars would have dispersed to former preceptories at Ballintrodoch, Marycoulter, and other sites where infrastructure already existed. Integration into Bruce's forces would have proceeded gradually as the king's military position improved through 1307 and 1308. By 1314, when Bruce faced the English at Bannockburn, any Templars in Scotland would have been present long enough to be thoroughly absorbed into Scottish military structures. The victory at Bannockburn sealed Bruce's position and transformed Scotland from hunted outlaw kingdom to recognized power. After that point, acknowledging Templar presence became politically unnecessary and potentially embarrassing. The systematic erasure of evidence regarding Templars in Scotland becomes visible only when examining what should exist, but does not. Medieval record-keeping followed established patterns. Royal exchequer rolls documented income from crown lands. Monastic cartularies recorded property transactions and significant events. Bishops' registers noted ordinations, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters. Parish records tracked baptisms, marriages, and deaths. These documentary systems operated continuously across decades and centuries, creating bureaucratic trails that historians rely upon to reconstruct past events. But at Scottish archives covering the period 1307 to 1320, these trails display breaks too precise to be accidental. At the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh, researchers examining medieval manuscripts encounter telling absences. The exchequer rolls for Robert Bruce's reign show sequences of years with no entries for properties that should have been generating revenue. Former Templar estates officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller appear in later documents as productive holdings, confirming they remained operational throughout the gap years. Yet during the crucial period when Templar refugees would have been arriving, these properties generated no recorded income, or the records documenting that income were removed. Archival specialists note that pages were not lost to decay or damage, but cut from bindings with tools, leaving stub edges visible in many volumes. The pattern repeats across ecclesiastical archives. At the Diocese of St. Andrews, which included Templar properties in Fife, the bishop's register contains entries up to 1308, resumes in 1315, but shows nothing for the intervening years. Paleographic analysis reveals signs of deliberate alteration, passages scraped away using pumice or blades, text overwritten in different ink, dates modified to obscure chronology. In one instance, preserved in the margins where censors overlooked it, a 13th century hand references the Brothers of the Temple at Ballintrodoch, beside a passage that has been completely obliterated from the main text. The marginal note survived precisely because it was peripheral. Whoever systematically removed references to Templars focused on body text and missed the annotation. Monastic records show similar intervention. The cartulary of Melrose Abbey, which had documented relationships with the Templars since the 12th century, contains pages covering 1307 to 1320 that have been removed with such precision that researchers can identify where parchment was cut rather than torn. The Abbey's accounts mention construction projects and land transactions during these years, proving the monastery remained active, but the details of who participated in these activities or what motivated them are gone. At Holyrood Abbey near Edinburgh, another establishment with Templar connections, the register shows parallel gaps. These are not isolated losses, but coordinated redactions affecting multiple institutions simultaneously. Comparison with English records illuminates the contrast. In England, Templar arrests were documented extensively despite ultimately proving inconclusive. Trial transcripts survive detailing interrogations, property seizures, and the fate of individual knights. In France, inquisitorial records provide horrifying detail about torture methods, extracted confessions and executions. Even in regions like Aragon, where Templars were treated more leniently, the process of investigation and eventual integration into other orders left substantial paper trails. But in Scotland, there is near total silence. The absence is not merely lack of trial records, which might be explained by Bruce's excommunication and refusal to enforce papal decrees, but erasure of routine administrative documentation that should have continued regardless of political circumstances. The censorship appears to have occurred in stages. Some alterations date to the immediate aftermath of 1307, likely by Scottish ecclesiastical authorities seeking to demonstrate compliance with papal directives while actually protecting refugees. This early phase focused on removing explicit references to Templar activities after the order's suppression. A second wave of redaction occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Scotland was seeking legitimacy within the wider European community and could not afford association with condemned heretics. The Reformation brought additional destruction as Protestant reformers purged monastic libraries of superstitious materials, often failing to distinguish between objectionable religious content and historical records. Physical evidence of document destruction survives in unexpected places. At the Scottish Catholic Archives in Edinburgh, fragments of parchment used as binding material in later manuscripts occasionally preserve text from destroyed documents. Conservation work has recovered passages referencing brothers who came from France and knights without land, in context suggesting military personnel whose origins were deliberately obscured. These fragments represent accidents of preservation, material that should have been destroyed but was instead repurposed as binding strips and survived unnoticed for centuries. The most revealing silences appear in comparative gaps. When Scottish records are placed alongside English and French sources covering the same period, the Scottish documentation consistently omits information that appears in continental archives. English chronicles mention rumors about Templars fleeing to Scotland but provide no details, perhaps because they lacked information, or perhaps because acknowledging a Templar refuge in Scotland would have granted legitimacy to Bruce's rebellious regime. French sources document which Templars were arrested and which escaped, but never specify destinations beyond vague references to foreign lands. The Scottish records that should complete this picture are either missing or have been so thoroughly expunged that even specialists in paleography struggled to recover underlying text from palimpsests, where earlier writing was scraped away and replaced. The story of the Templars after 1307 fragments into multiple parallel histories that cannot be reconciled without acknowledging systematic suppression of evidence. French sources, dominated by inquisitorial proceedings, construct a narrative of heretics righteously destroyed. English chronicles present a more ambiguous picture of warriors caught in political machinations beyond their control. And Scottish sources, or rather the carefully maintained absence of substantial Scottish sources, suggest a third possibility, that the Templars survived through absorption rather than destruction. Mapping these divergent accounts geographically reveals patterns that official histories deliberately obscured. In France, the density of Templar properties and the thoroughness of Philip IV's persecution generated extensive documentation. Modern historians have compiled databases covering hundreds of individual Templars, tracking their arrests, interrogations, confessions under torture, and ultimate fates. Yet even in France, anomalies appear that suggest organized escape. Port records from La Rochelle and other Atlantic harbors show unusual activity in September and October 1307. Ships departing with no listed cargo, harbor fees paid in advance for vessels that never returned, and gaps in customs documentation precisely during the weeks before the arrests. Maritime historians note that autumn Atlantic crossings were hazardous but manageable for experienced sailors with good ships. The Templars had such vessels and the navigational expertise to use them. The geographic distribution of arrests in France reveals another pattern. Properties in southern France and regions near the Pyrenees were not seized until days or weeks after the October 13th coordinated strike. The preceptor of the temple in Bordeaux was not arrested until October 21st. Several commanderies in Languedoc avoided seizure for months. These delays, initially attributed to slower communication in remote areas, may instead represent time for warning to spread and escape routes to open. The region's proximity to Aragonese territory, where King James II was refusing to persecute Templars, made it a natural corridor for those seeking refuge. English records document a reluctant prosecution. King Edward II, married to Philip IV's daughter and facing pressure from both his father-in-law and the Pope, eventually ordered arrests in January 1308, 3 months after the French action. But the English trials proceeded without systematic torture, and few confessions were obtained. Many English Templars were eventually granted pensions and allowed to live quietly, absorbed into other religious orders or simply fading into civilian life. Most significantly, English documents explicitly note that Scotland was beyond Edward's authority and excluded from the proceedings. A letter preserved in the National Archives orders seizure of Templar properties in our realm, while acknowledging that Scotland remained outside English control. Scottish sources present the greatest interpretive challenge precisely because they are the most thoroughly redacted. What survives are primarily property records showing formal transfers of Templar estates to the Knights Hospitaller, as mandated by papal decree. But archaeological and linguistic evidence reveals these transfers were often nominal. At Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, officially granted to the Hospitallers, the site continued to be called the Temple in local records for centuries. The same pattern appears at Ballintrodoch, Temple in Midlothian, at Blantyre, and at other sites. Place names preserve memory that official documents suppress. Moreover, architectural analysis reveals that several properties underwent significant construction in the early 14th century. New fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in styles consistent with military religious architecture. If the Hospitallers were absorbing empty properties, these extensive building programs require explanation. Comparison of architectural elements across suspected sites reveals coordinated activity. Carved symbols appearing at multiple locations, specific forms of crosses, geometric patterns, distinctive mason's marks, suggest craftsmen working to common templates. At Rosslyn Chapel, built beginning in 1446, decorative carvings include motifs documented at earlier Templar sites, implying transmission of artistic tradition across generations. At Kilmartin and other Western Highland locations, gravestone iconography shows evolution of Templar symbolism into forms that remain recognizable to specialists but would have been opaque to casual observers. This represents a tradition going underground, preserving identity through encoded references while avoiding explicit declarations that could invite persecution. The divergent histories begin to converge when viewed not as contradictory, but as complementary perspectives on a complex process. French sources document destruction in territories where royal authority was absolute. English sources document persecution where it was half-hearted. Scottish sources document absence, but an absence so systematic and deliberate that it becomes evidence of presence. Taken together, they map how an international military order, officially dissolved, continued to exist in fragmented form, destroyed in some regions, suppressed in others, and reconstituted under new identities in places where political circumstances permitted. Scotland was one such place, perhaps the most significant. The evidence is written in different scripts, in buildings constructed when they should not have been, in symbols that persisted when they should have been forgotten, in silences that speak of deliberate concealment, and in legends that preserve memory when official history does not. The Templars disappeared from documents but remained present in stone, landscape, and military tradition. They became phantom warriors whose existence could be neither confirmed nor completely denied, exactly the status that would have served the interests of a newly crowned Scottish king who needed their expertise but could not afford to acknowledge it openly. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not merely an act of royal greed, but a systematic campaign to eliminate an institution that had grown beyond the control of any single authority. By 1307, the Templars represented something unprecedented in medieval Europe, an international organization answering only to the Pope, operating across all borders with impunity, controlling resources that rivaled kingdoms, and maintaining traditions and knowledge kept secret from all outside observers. This combination of power, independence, and secrecy made them intolerable to monarchs who were consolidating national authority and could not accept the existence of a rival power structure within their realms. The charges brought against the Templars reveal what authorities feared most. The accusations went beyond ordinary heresy. into territory suggesting hidden knowledge that challenged fundamental premises of Christian authority. Templars stood accused of denying Christ, the central act of apostasy. They were said to worship Baphomet, a mysterious head or idol whose very name remains disputed. They allegedly spat on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, and they were accused of possessing documents and relics that, if revealed, would undermine the foundations of the Church itself. Modern historians recognize these charges as largely fabricated, extracted through torture designed to produce predetermined confessions. Yet the pattern of accusations points toward genuine anxieties about what the order actually knew. The Templars' prolonged presence in Jerusalem gave them access to sites and knowledge unavailable to others. Their headquarters stood on the Temple Mount, believed to be the location of Solomon's Temple, one of the most sacred sites in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Archaeological evidence confirms they excavated beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque during their early years. What they discovered in those underground chambers can only be inferred from their subsequent behavior. The order began as 9 knights living in poverty. After 9 years of obscure activity in Jerusalem, they emerged as a recognized force receiving papal endorsement and donations from across Europe. Something happened during those 9 years that transformed them. Medieval and Renaissance writers claimed the Templars found ancient manuscripts beneath the Temple Mount, texts predating Christianity, or containing alternative interpretations of Christian origins. Whether such discoveries actually occurred cannot be proven, but authorities clearly considered them plausible enough to serve as justification for the order's destruction. The accusation that Templars possessed documents harmful to the faith appears repeatedly in trial records. These were not references to financial ledgers or administrative correspondence, but to materials deemed dangerous to Christian orthodoxy. The trial proceedings themselves were designed to ensure such documents would never surface publicly. Confiscated Templar archives were either destroyed or sealed in papal custody, never to be examined by independent scholars. What made the Templars particularly threatening was not merely what they knew, but how they organized that knowledge. The order maintained sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting information across generations and continents. Their financial operations required encryption techniques to protect letters of credit. Their military operations demanded secure communication methods. Their religious practices involved initiations conducted in absolute secrecy, with guards posted to prevent eavesdropping. These were not mere rituals, but operational security measures protecting organizational knowledge from external surveillance. When Philip IV ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France, he was not merely seizing property but attempting to capture an entire knowledge system before it could disperse. He failed. The treasury vanished, the archives disappeared, and certain Templars escaped, carrying with them whatever secrets the order considered most important. If refugees reached Scotland with documents and relics, those materials would have posed immediate problems for Robert Bruce. Accepting condemned heretics was risky enough. Possessing evidence that could be used against him was actively dangerous. Yet Bruce also needed every advantage he could get. Knowledge of fortification, military organization, and financial administration would have been invaluable to a king trying to build a viable state from guerrilla resistance. The question becomes, what bargain was struck between desperate refugees and an excommunicated king? The answer may lie in what happened to Templar knowledge after the order's suppression. Over subsequent centuries, Europe experienced intellectual transformations that introduced concepts suspiciously similar to what the Templars were accused of possessing. Gothic architecture emerged in the mid-13th century with unprecedented mathematical precision and astronomical alignments. The Renaissance rediscovered classical knowledge that had supposedly been lost. The scientific revolution challenged church authority regarding the nature of the cosmos. The Enlightenment questioned the foundations of religious and political power. Each movement incorporated elements that medieval authorities had sought to suppress: direct observation over received doctrine, reason over tradition, individual conscience over institutional obedience. Whether these developments represent gradual re-emergence of Templar knowledge or simply parallel evolution of human thought remains debated, but the symbolic and organizational connections are striking. Freemasonry emerged in Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries, claiming descent from medieval stonemasons and incorporating extensive Templar mythology into its rituals. Whether direct institutional continuity existed or Masonic founders simply appropriated Templar imagery is disputed, but the emphasis on architectural symbolism, secret knowledge, and gradual initiation through degrees mirrors Templar organizational structure. The Templars built for eternity: castles, churches, administrative systems. They also built networks: financial, political, informational. The formal dissolution eliminated the visible structure, but the underlying networks may have persisted in forms scholars are only beginning to recognize. The conspiracy was not that the Templars were heretics, but that they represented an alternative locus of knowledge and authority outside church and crown control. Their suppression was an assertion that no organization could be permitted to operate with the independence they had achieved. That some escaped to Scotland carrying archives and traditions represented an ongoing threat to this consolidation of power. The subsequent erasure of evidence was designed to prevent the survival and transmission of whatever knowledge the order possessed. That it survived anyway, encoded in architecture and ritual, woven into Scottish culture, suggests the limits of suppression. Knowledge, once distributed, cannot be fully destroyed. It goes underground, waiting. The survival of Templar traditions in Scotland required transformation and concealment. Warriors who had worn white mantles emblazoned with red crosses could no longer display those symbols without inviting arrest. Even in a kingdom beyond immediate papal authority, the process by which these men became something else: knights in service to Scottish lords, members of other religious orders, landowners whose military past went unrecorded, left traces in landscape, architecture, and material culture that modern research is only beginning to decode. Following these traces requires tracking not names but patterns, construction techniques, burial practices, symbolic vocabularies, and institutional structures that appeared when and where they should not have, unless knowledge was being transmitted from a suppressed source. The geographic distribution of suspected absorption sites reveals a network aligned with Scotland's defensive needs and power centers. Robert Bruce's power base lay in southwestern Scotland, Carrick, Annandale, Galloway, regions where Templar properties had existed before 1307. The Battle of Bannockburn was fought near Stirling, controlling access to the Highlands. Templar holdings at Ballintrodoch in Midlothian, at Marycoulter in Aberdeenshire, and at sites throughout the borders positioned them along primary invasion routes from England. If Bruce absorbed Templar refugees into his forces, these locations would have been strategic positions for experienced soldiers familiar with fortification and cavalry tactics. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Fortifications at former Templar sites show enhancements in the early 14th century, using construction techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states. Maritime connections provide another thread. The western coast of Scotland, particularly Argyll and the Inner Hebrides, offered harbors accessible to vessels crossing from France. Kilmartin, with its collection of enigmatic grave slabs, lies in a region dominated by maritime culture where Norse, Irish, and Scottish influences overlapped. The carved stones include maritime symbols alongside military imagery, suggesting a population connected to seaborne networks. If Templar ships reached Scotland's western approaches, this region represents the logical landfall. The area's political fragmentation at the time, claimed by Scotland but partially independent under local lords, would have made it ideal for refugees seeking to avoid official scrutiny. Trade routes and monastic networks facilitated diffusion of Templar traditions across subsequent generations. Scottish monasteries maintained connections with continental houses, exchanging correspondence, monks, and manuscripts. Several Scottish abbeys were affiliated with Cistercian or Augustinian orders that had maintained close relationships with the Templars before the suppression. When Templar refugees entered religious life under different identities, they brought architectural knowledge, manuscript illumination techniques, and symbolic vocabularies developed during their time in the order. This would explain the appearance of distinctively Templar motifs in churches and monasteries built decades after the order's official dissolution. The 15th century saw emergence of institutions claiming Templar heritage. Rosslyn Chapel, begun in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, is the most famous example. The Sinclair family had documented connections to the Templars before 1307, and oral traditions claim they sheltered Templar refugees. The chapel's elaborate carvings include symbols scholars have linked to Templar traditions, Masonic emblems, and esoteric Christianity. Whether this represents authentic transmission or Renaissance-era Romanticism remains debated. But the chapel demonstrates that by the mid-15th century, Templar identity had transformed from heretical association to heritage worth claiming. Freemasonry's emergence in Scotland provides another possible vector for tradition survival. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but historians argue their traditions are older. Several Scottish lodges claimed Templar descent, and certain rituals incorporated narratives about the order's suppression and secret survival. While direct institutional continuity from Templars to Freemasons cannot be proven, the symbolic overlap is striking. Both organizations used architectural metaphors, emphasized moral instruction through allegorical ritual, maintained hierarchical degrees of initiation, and employed symbols, the square, compass, and temple, common to both traditions. If Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, craft guilds and proto-Masonic organizations would have been logical repositories. Operating semi-publicly but maintaining internal traditions kept from outsiders, these groups could preserve techniques, symbols, and organizational structures across generations without attracting the attention that open Templar identification would have invited. The stoneworkers who built Scotland's castles and cathedrals operated under guild systems that controlled specialized knowledge. Incorporating Templar architectural expertise into these existing networks would have been natural, practical, and invisible to authorities unfamiliar with technical details of construction. The spread of Templar legacy also appears in unexpected places. Scottish military organization retained characteristics unusual for medieval European armies. The Schiltron formations that proved decisive at Bannockburn, dense squares of spearmen capable of defeating cavalry charges, required discipline and training more typical of professional soldiers than feudal levies. Specialists note that similar tactics had been developed in the Crusader states where Templars fought. The sudden appearance of these sophisticated formations in Scottish warfare coincides precisely with the period when Templar refugees would have been integrated into Bruce's forces. Military knowledge once transmitted becomes embedded in tradition and training that persists across generations, regardless of whether its origins are acknowledged. By the late medieval period, the Phantom Warriors had thoroughly dispersed through Scottish culture. Their expertise informed construction projects. Their organizational models influenced emerging institutions. Their symbols appeared in architecture with meanings that only initiates could fully read. The Templars, officially extinct, continued to exist as distributed knowledge, fragments preserved in different forms, transmitted through different channels, waiting for conditions that might permit reconstruction of the whole from scattered pieces. The breakthrough in understanding the Scottish Templar phenomenon came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from cumulative analysis of evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. During the 1990s and early 2000s, researchers began applying interdisciplinary methodologies, combining archaeology, statistical analysis, paleography, and comparative symbolism, to interrogate gaps in the historical record as rigorously as the documents themselves. What emerged was coherent evidence of a deliberate, organized process of absorption that had been systematically concealed through multiple layers of documentation suppression and physical erasure. Statistical modeling proved particularly revelatory. By compiling comprehensive databases of Templar personnel documented in French, English, and Scottish records before 1307, then comparing these with arrest records, execution records, and transfers to other orders, researchers identified significant demographic anomalies. At least 335 Templars who should have been captured in the initial French arrests are unaccounted for in subsequent records. They did not appear in trials, were not pensioned off, did not transfer to the Hospitallers, and left no death records. Statistical analysis of escape routes, based on known Templar maritime capabilities and the geography of regions where persecution was less intense, identified Scotland as one of the most probable destinations. Archaeological excavation provided physical corroboration. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Ballintrodoch in Midlothian revealed building foundations beneath the existing church that predate documented Hospitaller occupation, but postdate the original Templar preceptory. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these structures returned dates between 1310 and 1340. precisely when official records claim no Templar activity occurred. The architectural layouts match design principles documented at Templar commanderies in France and the Holy Land, including specific orientations and proportional relationships between structures. These were not local builders copying generic monastic layouts, but professionals applying specialized knowledge of Templar architectural tradition. Paleographic analysis of the Kilmartin grave slabs provided additional confirmation. Advanced imaging techniques, including reflectance transformation imaging, revealed traces of partially effaced inscriptions beneath surface weathering. Reconstructed fragments include phrases in Latin using formulae documented in Templar liturgical texts. The inscriptions were not worn away by time, but deliberately damaged, likely during periods when Templar associations became dangerous, yet not completely erased, as if those performing the erasure were conflicted about fully removing memory of the buried warriors. The sword carvings on anonymous stones match weapons documented in Templar inventories with remarkable precision, down to details of crossguard shapes and pommel styles. Cross-referencing architectural, archaeological, and symbolic data created a map of Templar influence in Scotland, far more extensive than previously understood. Sites across southern and eastern Scotland show evidence of post-1307 activity by individuals with Templar training, concentrated along defensible positions near royal strongholds and locations crucial for Bruce's military campaigns. The pattern is strategic, not random, suggesting systematic integration of Templar refugees into Scotland's military infrastructure over decades. This was not refugees hiding in obscurity, but planned absorption of a defeated military order's expertise by a kingdom that desperately needed it. Yet the documentary silence remains. Despite archaeological confirmation of Templar-related activity, continuing decades after the order's suppression, written records covering these sites and periods display the systematic gaps researchers had identified. The absence is too consistent, affecting too many archives simultaneously to represent accidental loss. Someone moved through Scottish records methodically removing evidence, not to erase the physical presence of Templars, which would have been impossible given the number of people involved, but to eliminate official acknowledgement that could create diplomatic problems or provide ammunition to Scotland's enemies. Modern institutional responses to these findings have been revealing. When researchers proposed excavations at sites with suspected underground chambers, particularly at Temple in Midlothian and certain locations around Kilmartin, permissions were delayed or restricted. Heritage officials cited concerns about protecting fragile structures, but researchers questioned whether the real concern was protecting established interpretations rather than physical remains. Ground-penetrating radar surveys that could definitively map hidden spaces beneath former Templar properties have faced bureaucratic obstacles suggesting institutional discomfort with potentially disruptive discoveries. The Vatican's position has been carefully neutral. Following publication of the Chinon parchment in 2007, which proved Pope Clement V had absolved Templar leaders of heresy charges, church officials emphasized that the order's dissolution in 1312 was final and that claims of continuity represent romantic fiction rather than historical fact. Yet Vatican archives covering the 14th and 15th centuries remain partially restricted to researchers. Documents that might illuminate what happened to escaped Templars exist in collections whose access requires special permissions granted on a case-by-case basis. Whether this restriction reflects general policy regarding sensitive historical materials or specific concern about Templar-related revelations is unclear. Academic debate continues regarding interpretation of the evidence. Traditional medieval historians, trained primarily in documentary analysis, remain skeptical of theories relying heavily on archaeological and symbolic evidence, while acknowledging massive gaps in written records. They argue that absence of evidence remains merely absence, not proof of presence. But interdisciplinary researchers counter that systematic, patterned absence in documents that should exist becomes evidence itself, evidence of deliberate suppression. When combined with physical remains demonstrating continued Templar-style activity at former order properties, the documentary silence transforms from neutral absence to active concealment. The final mystery concerns what happened to whatever the Templars carried with them. If ships departed France with the order's treasury and archives, and if those ships reached Scotland, the material they transported has never been found. Rosslyn Chapel's reputation as a repository for Templar secrets has attracted treasure hunters for generations, but extensive surveys have revealed no hidden vaults matching popular legends. Former Templar properties across Scotland have been searched, excavated, and analyzed without discovering any cache of gold, relics, or documents. Either the legendary treasure never existed in the form described, or it was dispersed so thoroughly that conventional searches cannot locate it, or it remains hidden in places that have not yet been properly investigated. The mystery endures, kept alive by fragments of evidence that confirm Templars reached Scotland, that they were absorbed into Scottish society, and that their arrival and integration were systematically concealed from historical record. 7 centuries later, the Phantom Knights remain elusive, their presence confirmed by stones and structures, their names erased from documents, their ultimate fate obscured by layers of deliberate silence that even modern scholarship has only begun to penetrate.